In this module, we will consider the topic of Latin literature, which in and of itself is rather large. And so the goal of this short lecture is to review some key topics related to Latin literature, in particular, to talk about periodization of the study of Latin literature so that we can recognize the key phases of the literary development of the Latin language. Two, to think about some of the themes that Latin literature addresses in general, and then to preview the work of the poet Virgil, the Aeneid, which is our assigned reading during this module, which will give us some exposure to one of the key works of Latin literature that survives from antiquity. As a literary language, Latin developed over the course of the first millennium BC. And so the earliest period that scholars tend to discuss is the so-called Early Latin or Old Latin, which stretches down to about 80 BC. Latin's emergence as a literary language comes pretty late in this time frame, as the preeminent literary language of the first millennium BC Mediterranean world was Greek. Now, during the 3rd century BC, Roman political expansion brought the Romans and their culture more closely in contact with the Greek world, and this close contact influenced the development of a Latin literature proper, with a lot of borrowings from the Greek literature, it should be pointed out. An early and important literary figure in this time period is the author called Plautus, who lived from about 254 to 184 BC. Plautus is a key author who mostly writes dramatic works that are comedic in their nature. Now, before Latin was a literary language proper, it still existed as a language. People were still writing it. And so some of our earliest evidence for written Latin, not literary Latin, but written Latin, comes from inscriptions. Inscription meaning a text that is scratched, etched, or engraved on a permanent or semi-permanent material, most often stone, metal, wood, terracotta. One of our earliest examples of inscribed Latin is the so-called Lapis Niger inscription, Lapis Niger in Latin meaning the black-colored stone. This inscription comes from central Rome, from the Roman Forum, and dates between about 570 and 550 BC, so around about the middle of the 6th century BC. This is a text that's still a little bit mysterious in that we can't quite make out all of its vocabulary and grammar. It is an official text, a public text, likely of a ritual or official nature. It is written in the format we call boustrophodon. Boustrophodon meaning as the cow or as the oxen plow the field, meaning that the directionality of the lines alternates between right to left and left to right. We can see in the text indication of its official nature here in the 5th line, regei, the archaic Latin for to the king, indicating this may be an official document or a ritual text. And you can see an example, the example of what the Lapis Niger looks like today, giving you a sense of what the letter forms look like. The next literary period following the early Latin is the time that scholars call the Golden Age, from 80 BC to about AD 14. This is the high point, the apogee of Latin literary culture, when the language has hit its stride as a literary language. Some of its most important authors are alive and active during this time. Scholars subdivide the Golden Age into 2 sub-periods, the first being the so-called Age of Cicero, 80 to 43 BC, the time period of the career of the great Roman statesman, lawyer, politician, and author Marcus Tullius Cicero, whose body of speeches, law cases, philosophy, letters represents one of our most important assemblages of Latin surviving from antiquity. The second subperiod is the age of Augustus, the Emperor Augustus, heir and great-nephew of the dictator Julius Caesar, from 43 BC until AD 14, AD 14 being the year in which Augustus died. During this time period, Augustus himself promoted literature and promoted Latin literary culture. He did this by acting as a patron, an artist's patron, collecting a group of authors and artists around him, promoting and sponsoring their works, and in some cases even giving them special requests, instructions about the kinds of literary output that he wanted to see from them. A key example here is the poet Virgil, deemed by many to be the most important of the Latin poets, whose main work, the Aeneid, we're going to be reading selections of during this module. The Aeneid, an epic poem designed to provide a backstory for the Roman people, to connect them to a larger and deeper epic and cultural tradition in the Mediterranean. You see here a couple of images from the so-called Vergilius Vaticanus, an early manuscript of Virgil's Aeneid, the Vatican Virgil, literally, which dates to about AD 400. This manuscript, which you can see is illustrated with drawings, is one of only 3 illustrated manuscripts of classical literature to come down to us from Roman antiquity, and it shows us that the Aeneid was important from the beginning. It's not just that we in the 21st century decided it was important, but it's an important poem for the Romans from the time that it was written and published. More on the Aeneid and on Virgil in a couple of minutes. Following the Golden Age comes the so-called Silver Age from AD 14 until about AD 138. This is a less productive period in literary terms, when the literary output is less certain, when we see slightly different works, slightly different genres being popular, especially epigram, 2-line poetry, and satire, various satirical works that tend to comment on contemporary social, moral, political woes. So not quite a grandiloquent time as the Golden Age had been. One interesting phenomenon of the Silver Age is the so-called Archaising Period from the mid to the late 2nd century, when we see authors making a deliberate return to older style and older vocabulary, perhaps to lend more weight to their work. An important author of this Archaising movement is Aulus Gellius, who writes a very fascinating book called The Attic Nights, the Noctes Atticae, and uses this Archaising style in his own work. Following that Silver Age and its Archaising phenomenon comes the Patristic period from the late 2nd to the 5th centuries AD. The main literary output in this time period is Christian writing, so we call this patristic based on the fact that these are the writings of the church fathers, the patres of the Christian church, thus the label for the period. The goal of these early church writers is to spread Christian spirituality and the messages related thereto via their writings. So they intentionally avoid complex grammar, syntax, in order to achieve better readability. And this is what we see as the emergence of the so-called vulgar or common Latin, to make the Latin text more accessible to more people, and thus further the aims of what the Christian church was up to. Following on the patristic period, the time of medieval Latin, from the 6th to the 14th centuries AD. During this time period, a whole lot of things are going on, but some key ones to focus on. First, the further development of the vulgar Latin language. The Christian church during this time period becomes more and more cemented in the Mediterranean, and thus the need to spread the Christian message is very obvious. Also, during this time, the politics aside, the Roman Empire falls apart and reorganizes itself in various ways, and one of the results of the fragmentation of the Roman Empire is regional language change, and we see the development or the emergence by region of the Romance languages. These are the Latin language's daughters, as linguists call them. Latin, the parent language; the Romance language, the daughter languages. Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and Romansh are all direct offspring, so to speak, of the Latin language. As a language itself, Latin continues to be the living and idiomatic language of the Christian church, as well as the common language of intellectuals, scholars, academics, still use Latin for communicating with each other and for writing and publishing their papers. Dante, who we'll mention again in a moment, active during the later end of this period, and wrote in both the vernacular, in the Romance language that he was born into, what we call Italian, and also in Latin. And you can see here sort of the family tree of the Latin language, where we see Latin here being subdivided into the classical and vulgar forms, and then through various periods of descent from vulgar Latin, the Romance languages. And I've highlighted Romanian, the Italian dialects, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. So this is essentially the continuity of Latin in today's world is the world of the Romance languages. A key figure at this sort of point of language interchange is the poet Dante Alighieri, who was born about 1265 and lives till 1321, the father of the Italian language for many points of view, and the so-called supreme poet of Italian, il sommo poeta, whose writing is sort of, the acme of his writing is his Commedia Divina, the Divine Comedy, which is a master work inspired by classical works, but written in Italian. So Dante, a pioneer in a new tradition of literature, Italian literature, following on the Latin one. Dante did write in Latin as well, so the fact that he sits astride this important literary transition makes him all the more important. Now, one of the things that literature scholars tend to talk about is genre. Genre meaning a category of literary composition, and when we talk about Latin, we tend to have two main genre categories, which can be further subdivided, but two main categories: the prose category, that is written language in its ordinary form without any metrical structure, and poetry, literature using aesthetic and rhythmic qualities, and that relies upon a metrical structure. Genres to be familiar with as they pertain to Latin are these: comedy, type of writing obviously is intended to be humorous; history. Within the historical genre, we can see two main traditions: the so-called annalists, those that write year-by-year historical accountings, and biographers, who are interested in writing accounts of the lives of famous people. Sometimes those are contemporary living famous people, and sometimes they are famous people from previous time periods. Poetry, very important. We can see three subdivisions of poetry. Epic poetry, lengthy narrative poems that focus on serious topics, often including the deeds of heroes and various other events that are significant to the identity of a certain culture group. The Aeneid fits in here. Lyric poetry, poetry that expresses some kind of emotion or feeling, sometimes happy emotion, sometimes not so happy. A subcategory of lyric is amatory poetry, love poetry. And then epigram, brief satirical poems, often 2 lines for epigram, satirical poems that poke fun at something. Sometimes a person or an idea or a cultural tradition can be the target of the sort of the biting language of epigram. And then oratory, published speeches, rhetoric, speeches that are disseminated as literary showpieces. So this has been a brief overview of the periods and the genres of Latin literature to familiarize you with this important topic. Now, in order to have some experience with Latin, we're going to be reading some sections of Virgil's Aeneid in translation. So a few words on Virgil himself and on what the Aeneid is all about. So Virgil, whose real name, his actual name, Publius Vergilius Maro, is born in 70 BC and dies in 19 BC. His name is variously given as Virgil with an E or Virgil with an I in English. He's the same person, whichever way it happens to be spelled. He's the author of a number of works, but in our class we're especially interested in the poem called the Aeneid. And as we said, Virgil was a literary client who was sponsored by the Emperor Augustus. Now, Augustus wanted a national epic for the Roman people. Virgil, in effect, is commissioned directed to write this epic, it's a pretty big challenge, right? If the supreme political leader comes to you and says, I would like you to write, please, a national epic poem that explains the origins of the Roman civilization and the Roman state, it's a pretty tall job. Virgil, I guess fortunate for him, is a very talented poet and creates the Aeneid, which may have been partially unfinished or not quite finished at his death in 19 BC. Nevertheless, the poem is widely circulated. It becomes very important in antiquity and has been important ever since its publication in 19 BC for everyone who studies Roman culture. So how does Virgil come up with the Aeneid? What influences him? Well, a key influence on Virgil is the poetry of the Greek poet we call Homer. Homer, the original Greek epic writer, who's thought to have lived most likely during the 8th century BC and created two epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, both of which are connected to the narrative of the Trojan War. The Iliad set during the last phases of the war itself, focused in particular on the Greek hero Achilles, and the Odyssey set after the war is over, and the focus here is on the Greek hero Odysseus, who is trying to get home from the Trojan War, only to find out that he still has a lot of heroic challenges to face before he can get back home after having been away for 10 years fighting in the Trojan War. Homer writes his poems in the so-called epic meter, the rhythm of epic poetry, which we call the dactylic hexameter. This is important because Virgil will do the same. Now, when we translate the Latin poem into English, it's hard to preserve the meter. But it's important to know that were you reading the Aeneid in Latin, or if you were living in antiquity and experiencing it firsthand, you would hear it in meter. And oftentimes, these poems that are really, they're designed to be performed, to be recited aloud, would be accompanied by music to help the poet keep the rhythm. It's a very rhythmic experience to listen to epic poetry. So Homer sets the tone here, not just for Virgil, but for pretty much everyone else who wants to write epic poetry. And so Virgil uses his knowledge of Homer in his structuring of the Aeneid, and he incorporates Homeric elements that would definitely have been recognizable and familiar to his contemporary audience. The Aeneid is divided into 12 books, and in the structure of the 12 books, we see echoes of both Homeric poems, both the Iliad and the Odyssey. The first 6 books, books 1 through 6, are essentially the Odyssey-inspired component of the Aeneid, where Aeneas is trying to get away from Troy, his homeland, which has been destroyed by war, and he's told by the gods that he needs to go to the west. He needs to go to Italy, what will become Italy, and that he's supposed to carry with him the remnants of the Trojan culture there and to set up things anew. This is his divinely appointed goal or task, and despite giving him this job, as you will see, the gods in some cases go to great lengths to interfere with his ability to actually carry it out. He does arrive in Italy, but the struggles are not over. And so books 7 through 12, Aeneas' struggles after arriving in Italy, which involves a lot of warfare. This is the Iliad-inspired component of the Aeneid. So there's a bit of inversion based on the Homeric model on Virgil's part, but the inspiration for the structure and some of the episodes is clearly Homeric in its nature. Things to pay attention to as you read your assigned portions of the Aeneid, and I encourage you to read more if you wish, but definitely read the parts that we have marked out for the assignments. Focus on the concepts of fate and the role of and motivation for divine intervention in the experiences of Aeneas. What are the gods doing? Why are they acting as they do? What's at stake for them? And this is part of the narrative as well, that Virgil is carefully constructing for you. You also will want to reflect upon loss and its opposite, concept, gain, as part of the hero's experience. You will notice a lot of loss from Aeneas's point of view in the books of the Aeneid that you will be reading. And you want to think about, beyond the emotional impact of the losses that he experiences, what the effect of these losses are on his mission to reach Italy, and how they affect his development as a character. Now, modern scholars, following the example of the anthropologist Joseph Campbell, speak of the journey of the hero. And this is another thing to track as you read through the Aeneid. You may want to use this diagram to help plot out the episodes in your assigned books, and pay attention to what stages of the hero's experience Aeneas is going through, and to chart in the revelations, the losses, the challenges that Aeneas has to survive, literally survive, in order to complete his divine mission. So the Aeneid, overall, from the Roman point of view, is seen as a national myth, a national epic, which helps them to explain their origins, where it is that they come from, how it is that they ended up at Rome, how they managed to develop into a sophisticated culture as they did. And so Virgil will use foreshadowing, cultural foreshadowing, to foretell the coming prominence and fame of the Roman people. And so the poem is much more than just a poem, right? It is a beautiful poem, masterfully written, but it also is more than that. It serves as a key piece of ideology about what it means to be Roman, and how the Roman world is conceived of, and how it is organized. And so these are various things that you want to keep in mind as you read the epic, and think about the effects on contemporary listeners. Think about not only Virgil's motivation, but the motivation of his artistic patron, namely the Emperor Augustus. Why does Augustus want this myth to be written this way? So, with this brief overview in mind, I hope you will launch yourselves into the consideration of Latin literature, and I look forward to hearing your reactions and questions in the discussion forum.